Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me in my new message today. In today's message, I want to talk about the topic of true worship. More specifically, I want to talk about what worship is and how we can truly worship God. And I think it is very important to look into the Bible and understand what the Bible says about what worship is and what God intends worship to be, because only then, when we understand this and put aside our preconceived notions about what we may think worship is, we can be changed by our worship and our worship can actually be meaningful and impactful. So, before I want to get into what worship is, I want to first talk about what worship isn't. Worship isn't only about the songs or the lyrics or the melodies that we sing. Worship isn't only about the instruments or any music that is playing. Although all these things are good things to lead our hearts into worship and lead our hearts into praise, we can still worship God without needing any of these things. So, the first point I want to make about what true worship is that true worship is complete surrender and sacrifice to God. And to demonstrate this point even more, I want to read this one verse in which Paul is saying in Romans 12, verses 1, this verse in which he says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, or in other versions it says your reasonable worship. So we can see in the context of this verse, in which Paul is talking about giving our reasonable worship, he isn't mentioning any music at all or mentioning any songs. And also, when he says earlier in the verse that we must present our bodies as a living sacrifice to God, which is our reasonable worship, we can clearly see here that Paul is saying that we truly worship God and serve Him, not by just a one time moment thing where we sing some songs in church and then go away and call that true worship. No, that's not what Paul is implying here, but Paul is saying that true worship is an everyday lifestyle. Worshiping God is a lifestyle, and we serve Him by the way we live our everyday lives. Because when we present our bodies as a living sacrifice to God, in order to live like this, we have to completely surrender our lives to God and make Him the center of our lives. We need to make Him the priority over everything in our life. And that is how we can truly worship God, by offering our bodies as a living sacrifice to God. And that is true worship. And the second point I want to make about what true worship is that true worship is having deep reverence and awe for God and also understanding His character. And to look into this point even more, I want to read into another verses in Hebrews 12, verses 28 and 29, in which the author of Hebrews is saying, Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace, by which we may serve, or in other versions again, it says worship, God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. In verse 29, it says, For our God is a consuming fire. So we can clearly see here in verse 28, the author is saying, We are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, which is referring to the new covenant that God gave us through Jesus Christ, that we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. And because of this, we need to worship God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. And I really like how the author of Hebrews is saying how we should worship God. And by saying we should worship God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, he's clearly implying that we shouldn't just worship in a casual way, but when we worship God, we should come into His presence with deep respect and deep reverence for who He is. And the reason why I think this is hard for many of us to do is that we don't truly understand the true character of God. Because in verse 29, Hebrews describes God as being, in verse 29, for our God is a consuming fire. But we don't understand this sometimes because we don't truly spend enough time in prayer and enough time in devotion to God to truly understand His character or understand who He is. But when we do that, when we actually take the time to truly worship Him and understand His character, that will bring us to humility and compel us to bring the best of our worship to God. Now, there are many examples in the Bible of people bringing this type of worship to God and God blessing them as a result of this. But one of my favorite examples of this is in John chapter 12, when Jesus is in the town of Bethany and he is in the home of Martha. And this is a few days after he raised Lazarus from the dead. And while he was in Martha's home, we can see here that Martha's younger sister, Mary, she takes this costly oil, and the name of this oil is actually called spikenard, which was a costly perfumed ointment, which was of much value in ancient times. And she takes this costly oil and she pours it all on the feet of Jesus, and she anoints Jesus' feet with her hair. She wipes his feet with her hair. So we can see here that this act of worship that Mary did was so powerful, and there are also a few remarks about this passage that this oil that Mary poured on Jesus, it was so costly that this was all the inheritance that Mary had. This was all she had, but yet she poured it all on the feet of Jesus. And we can see that later in this passage that Judas makes a remark about this act that Mary did, and he thinks this act is insane because he says to Jesus, why did Mary have to do this? She could have sold this oil for 300 denarii and it could have been given to the poor. And we can see here that Judas says this not because he actually cared about giving to the poor, but because he wanted to keep the money for himself. So we can see here that Judas viewed Jesus way differently than Mary did. Judas did not have that deep reverence for Jesus. That's why he thought the act of worship of pouring that costly oil on Jesus' feet was an insane act. But Mary viewed Jesus in a different way. She truly understood the character of Jesus and who he was. And that compelled Mary to bring out the best of whatever she had and pour it all on the feet of Jesus. And that should be our attitude whenever we worship God. We should always bring God our best of our worship because he is worthy of all our praise. And we can see here that when we bring this act of worship to God, we can even see the situation around us start to change. And one of my favorite examples of this again in the Bible is in Acts 16 when Paul and Silas were in prison. They were thrown into prison in this chapter because they cast out a demon out of a girl who used to make money for her masters by telling fortunes to other people. And the demon inside of her were able to see the future of other people, and she would make money for her masters by telling these fortunes to other people. But then when Paul casted this demon out of this girl, we can see the masters get mad at this, and as a result, they throw Paul and Silas into prison. Now we can see that while they're in this miserable situation behind the jail cells and they were shackled with chains around their hands, this miserable situation that they were in still didn't stop them from glorifying and praising God. And we can see and read in Acts 16 that in the middle of the night, while they were still in prison, they started to clap their hands and sing songs to God. And while they were bringing this worship to God, we can suddenly see the situation around them suddenly start to change. We can see that as they worship God, that suddenly there was a violent earthquake in the prison. And it was so violent that the jail cells and doors flew wide open, and the chains of every prisoner in the jail cell fell loose. We can see the miserable situation that Paul and Silas was in completely changed because of their worship that they brought to God. And that should also apply to our daily lives right now, that no matter what situation we're in, whether it's good or bad, that Jesus is still worthy of all our praise. And I believe if we bring this true worship out of deep respect and humbleness to God, that we can actually see a situation around us or a problem around us start to change as a result of this. Now, to conclude this message, I want to read two final verses in which Jesus is talking about how to truly worship God, in which he says in John 4, verses 23 and 24. And I really love these verses in which Jesus says, starting from verse 23, "But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth." And verse 24, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. And verse 24, Jesus says, "God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." So let us take this reminder about what true worship is and how we can worship God not in a general, just laid back way, but in a place of having deep awe and reverence for him. And that should bring us or compel us to bring Jesus the best of whatever we have, no matter what situation we're in, because he is worthy of all our praise. And that is what true worship is. And I believe that as we go through our life, as we bring this true worship and worship God and make it our daily lifestyle to bring him praise, I believe that as we do that, and we can see many examples in the Bible that are situations that may seem rough and miserable, that it can start to change as a result of our true worship. Our worship can actually be meaningful and impactful, and that is what true worship is. So I hope this message is able to encourage you, and I'll see you on the next message.